Good evening, everyone. I hope everybody has a place that they can find to sit down and get comfortable. I'm really pleased to welcome everyone here tonight on behalf of the Sabin Vaccine Institute and our influenza team at Sabin. In particular, I'd like to thank my team, Marissa Malchione, Sarah Penny, and Brian Shaw, for the incredible amount of work that they put in, work and creativity that they put into planning tonight's event. So if you would all give them a big round of applause. As some of you know, the turnout for the event was in fact overwhelming. And we, for those, not all of you, the lucky ones in the room, but for those of you that you may know who didn't make it in, our apologies. It was an incredible, incredible response, and we're really excited to have everyone here. I hope you've had an opportunity to enjoy the environs of the Titanic Museum and maybe learn something a little new. I had been debating whether I would share this personal vignette, and I was encouraged to do so. In addition to being particularly struck by the slides that I saw from my team when they were suggesting that we do this event here, and I saw the picture of the grand stairwell and thought, oh yeah, I think we need to do it there. What a photo op. I was also struck by it because the Titanic in its journey represents a little personal convergence for me, both personally and professionally. My grandfather was supposed to be a passenger on the Titanic at the age of 2 years old. And his family he was born and raised in Sweden, but his family had booked passage to be able to visit family in the United States. And so they'd come, they actually came to Ireland to embark on that journey. And it was in fact only because of a case of rubella that my grandfather had that left them on the shores of Ireland instead of on the museum, on the Titanic. So I'm pleased that I can be here at the museum today, not to in any way diminish, obviously, the tragedy of those events, but it is amazing to think about how those small things, and in particular, infectious diseases, guide our lives in so many different ways. I also hope that people have had a chance now to connect with both sort of longtime and new friends and colleagues. We're really pleased to be able to turn the focus of the evening now to a discussion that we're going to have around ideas and opportunities for shaping the future of what we hope will be a truly global next generation influenza vaccine research ecosystem. We've had the great benefit of working in collaboration with an amazing team that has built a really critical tool for shaping the future of influenza vaccine research. The Influenza Vaccine Roadmap was a project that was initiated in 2018 by the Global Funders Consortium for Universal Influenza Vaccine Development. The project was funded by Wellcome, and it was led by the amazing team at CIDRAP, which includes Mike Osterholm, who unfortunately couldn't be here with us tonight because he's about to be the Grand Marshal tomorrow of the University of Minnesota Homecoming Parade with his grandkids on the float. And also Chris Moore and Julia Ostrowski, who have been just instrumental in making the roadmap turn into a living document and a living tool. The roadmap itself was launched in 2021, and it represents the collective work and engagement of over 100 scientific, policy, and funding experts and decision makers. I'm fortunate to have a number of those individuals join me tonight for this conversation. And I'll take the opportunity now to introduce them. Chris Chadwick, who is a technical officer within the Influenza Preparedness and Response Division at WHO. Ros Hollingsworth, who is a senior program officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, supporting R&D for influenza and other respiratory viruses. Eric Karikari-Boateng, who is the director for the Center for Laboratory Services and Research at the Ghana FDA, their regulatory agency. Tiago Rocca, who is the lead for strategic partnerships and business development at Instituto Butantan in Brazil, which is a key organization that involved in the development and manufacture of vaccines in Brazil. And William Ampofo, who is the professor and head of the virology department at Noguchi Memorial Institute for Medical Research at the University of Ghana. He additionally serves as the chair of the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative, and he is the secretary to the Presidential Committee for Vaccine Manufacturing and Development in Ghana. So many of you who are sitting in the room tonight have really been at the core of the response to the COVID pandemic. And the world has both marveled and benefited enormously from the breakthroughs that you helped to drive in vaccine research and development. Through that experience, I think we've learned that hyper-focused goals and guarantees of funding and markets are clear drivers for accelerating science. But we also learn that the uneven distribution of that broad vaccine ecosystem, from upstream R&D to manufacturing, down to shots in arms, left us with stark inequities in many of the world from benefiting from the tremendous work that so many of you were a part of. So as the Influenza Vaccine Roadmap has been developed to drive this same kind of goal-oriented R&D agenda for next-generation influenza vaccines, it has key priorities and milestones. And we really want to take just an opportunity this evening to discuss what kind of coordinated and collaborative efforts can do to shape that new ecosystem so that it's primed for scientific breakthroughs that are responsive to the varying needs of populations around the globe and to ensure a future that is free from influenza and the threats of future pandemics. As we move into sort of a panel discussion, which I hope will be very much conversational, one of the things that I'd like to do is also encourage the audience to come with comments or questions throughout the discussion. We probably won't preserve time for just at the end, but really hope to have it be interactive. We have a couple handheld mics that are distributed throughout the room, so if there is something you want to say, please raise your hand. I'll keep a lookout for it, and hopefully we can get you engaged in the conversation as well. So with that, I'm going to move to this seat over here. I guess they'll shift the mic. And I think we'll start out with really, I think, a discussion about what do we know about the earlier work that the world had done in terms of pandemic preparedness that was so clearly informed by the influenza agenda. And I would love to go to Chris first to maybe talk a little bit about what the WHO and other key partners around the globe have been doing since 2005, really to drive that different space. What you learned before COVID that worked, that didn't work, and how that really informed where WHO went with the recent steps.
Yeah, thanks, Stacy, and thanks so much for inviting me to join this excellent panel. So yes, in 2006, WHO launched the Global Action Plan for Influenza Vaccines, and that was in direct response to the fear of H5N1 and this recognition that global vaccine production was strictly limited to high-income countries. And so how would we make sure that all countries would have access to influenza vaccines for that pandemic threat? And through that project, WHO facilitated technology transfer for egg-based, inactivated, and live attenuated influenza vaccines with huge support from a few governments. BARDA in the US government was a fantastic partner for the entirety of the project, PATH. And this was a 10-year strategy that was aimed at building that production in 14 low and middle income countries, all across the 6 WHO regions. And so it formally ended in 2016 and then sort of went on a little bit longer until 2019. And through that project, we really saw, so 14 manufacturers were identified, and some were not successful, some were incredibly successful. Butantan on the stage is actually the star of the Global Action Plan. And the way WHO first approached the gap was the initial focus was developing the pandemic influenza vaccine. And then sort of a few years later, we started to think about sustainability, and how you would sustain that production was through seasonal influenza vaccine production. Well, for the majority of these 14 countries, the seasonal influenza vaccine market just wasn't there. And so you can do so much work to build up the production at the manufacturer, but the ecosystem requires so much more attention to make sure that once the product is available, that it's actually being used. And I know that's clear to all of us. But years ago, some colleagues and I, we developed a simple slide just outlining, sustainability it's really your surveillance systems informing the evidence that, countries understand their burden of disease. That informs the development of vaccination policies that help stimulate demand, and then that incentivizes manufacturers to maintain or increase their supply. And that's the sustainable preparedness. And if you're missing any of those pieces, you're not going to have sustainable production in the end for preparedness. And so that was really a key issue that we learned sort of the hard way. Like I said, we thought about sustainability sort of on the back half of those 10 years. And so now for the mRNA Tech Transfer Hub, we're thinking about sustainability from day one.
And in terms of some of that opportunity with the technology, is there a sense that because of the versatility of the mRNA platform technology, that there may be more opportunity to guarantee that sustainability, both in terms of keeping the platforms warm, because the potential for a diverse development of vaccines is potentially greater, but then also the fact that attention is being paid from the outset to this issue around demand. William, I don't know if maybe that's something that you could speak to a little bit about, particularly in the context of thinking about the newer technologies and how that gets folded into to these ecosystems.
It's interesting that you picked me, because as Chris was talking, I was thinking about the PIP framework, because you said preparedness. And although GAP was designed to ramp up influenza vaccine production, looking at seasonal, the PIP framework was supposed to encourage virus sharing, so that were there to be a pandemic, we would be better prepared in terms of MTAs with manufacturers, pushing diagnostics, and have some funding that would push manufacturing towards to support the preparedness for the pandemic and the response. But looking at what happened with COVID, and where we had mRNA technology available, and looking at how COVAX was set up, I'm thinking that we have to see how, going forward, and using the PIP framework and mRNA technology, how this will actually ramp up to equitable distribution in terms of tech transfer for mRNA technology to enable us to respond better to a flu pandemic. That's the way I'm thinking about it, that this is the lesson that we have to learn, looking at what has happened with COVID and the existing infrastructure for influenza. Because we had the GAP program, We did have technology established to be able to produce influenza. But what happened with COVID makes us see that we need a wider, more efficient, and faster production capacity that will be equitable and also enable variation. I say this because, again, I was involved with the PIP framework. So one sticky issue was genome, virus genome, sharing, sequencing. And yet that has become one of the key parts of the surveillance for COVID. So going forward, we need to ensure that we will be able to share the sequence data very fast. This will push manufacturing, especially if we're looking at mRNA technology. So those are the comments that I have. Maybe
over to you, Tiago. Chris mentioned that Butantan is probably one of the best examples of how it actually worked the first time round. With that in mind, what did some of those initial investments in terms of the influenza work do that then actually has really allowed Butantan to grow and become an institute and an organization that's serving Brazil, that's serving the region in a way that goes well beyond influenza vaccines now?
Thanks, Stacey, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to have this night with all these influencers community and share this history with you. It's my pleasure because I lived this over the last 15 years when I arrived to work at Butantan, and I was talking with Chris before the panel, and before to have the manufacturing in place, we had the commitment to have the vaccination in place. So we had a public campaign that sustained investment to have a manufacturing site in Brazil. And as you know, we offer these vaccines for free to the population, not totally, but this year we are offering 8 million doses to the Brazilian population. So it sustained Butantan to become now the largest manufacturer in the South Hemisphere and one of the biggest in the world. But it's sustainable not because we would like to invest to have a manufacturing site, but because we have the vaccination program in place that every year offer the vaccine to the population. And also it's something that we saw in the country as quite strategic in case of a pandemic or a threat that we have for future pandemics. And in the middle of this technology transfer, we had the swine flu at H1N1 in 2009, 2010. So we know that we were in the right way. And other point that makes the business sustainable in Brazil, and Butantan took advantage of that we have a public procurement law that allows technology transfer business with the advantage to have the access to the market, to the public market. And this is not written for the pharma and vaccine business, but it was for the military use. So Brazil had a previous experience, and today it's one of the leaders on the aircraft manufacturing, and the militaries took advantage of that, and the public labs like Butantan, Biomanguinhos, why we cannot use this clause in the law to have technology transfer. It's a long-term agreement with companies to transfer the technology to the country and secure the supply and also the technology. So this is one example that how can it work. So first, one, it's the vaccination program, because otherwise you don't have the sustainable business. The other, it's the framework for the legislation that also supports not only the country to do this, but even the technology owner to have the security to share the technology. So I believe this is the ecosystem that we live. Not only if we have the case for influenza, for sure, but we have other programs, other projects, and other vaccines in these programs.
William or Eric, I might go back to you to just pick up on that point around this issue of sort of securing demand. And I know both of you are a bit more at the, you're a little bit more at the upstream level, but is that conversation part of how you're thinking about planning now as you think about the future? You think about this sort of this infrastructure that you want to build around vaccine development. What is the extent to which that's being factored in? What's the role perhaps in some of the conversations that you've had with Gavi, with entities like COVAX that one could imagine there will be similar needs for that kind of financing to be secured moving forward?
So it's good you mentioned Gavi because, so at least for Africa, there's been a continental push from the African Union. There's actually what we call a Partnership for Vaccine Manufacturing in Africa, the PAVM, and it has various pillars. There's technology transfer, there's capacity building, and one part of it is market shaping. And I think there's been an analysis that has been done. It looks at the African market, the potential of the African market, the various vaccines, not just for the expanded program of immunization, but looking at diseases that are, specific to Africa. And they've built up a value chain proposal and identified various diseases and set targets. So that's the political framework, but trying to make a business case. And so there are discussions, I think, ongoing with Gavi, looking at, again, the issue of, this is again where Eric will come in, about vaccines that will be made in Africa that will meet the WHO, PQ standards, meet the global standards, and discussions with Gavi about how this would be, could be factored into the, the purchasing requirements that exist with UNICEF and co. So these are discussions that are ongoing. And then we also have national programs that are being pursued in partnership with various entities that are all looking to provide a sustainable market for the production that is being encouraged by the private sector. He mentioned the legislation in Brazil. We have a similar issue also in Ghana, where we are preparing parliamentary approval for our vaccine roadmap in Ghana as a key part to ensure that this is a sustainable enterprise going forward.
Okay, thank you. If I may come in, we know it's not quite easy to manufacture vaccines, and yes, we need to manufacture vaccines on the continent, but it shouldn't be just any vaccine. They should be manufactured to meet the right quality standards. And that's where the African Vaccine Regulatory Forum comes inside. As at now, there are just 4 countries at maturity level 3. That's Ghana is 1, Nigeria is 1, Tanzania is 1, and Egypt is 1. And it's only Egypt that produces vaccine for now. And these countries are, the remaining countries are also planning to get, to manufacture vaccines. But what we've done is like trying to pool resources together, whereby almost every vaccine that will be manufactured will go through a central review at the AVRF platform at the WHO Secretariat, because looking at this, not all the countries that can assess the quality of these vaccines alone. So that's the strategy for now.
So I think, one of the things that's consistent throughout everything that we've heard is the issue of really needing to build that sustained capacity, that sustained demand, that opportunity, whether you're talking about the regulatory system, the R&D and the manufacturing community, or you're thinking about downstream in terms of demand, that it needs to be done sort of in the spaces where the vaccines are intended to have impact, and the work needs to occur there. What that requires is a workforce that's going to be able to sort of support all elements of that ecosystem. We know that more traditionally in the spaces of sort of driving the global health agenda, that hasn't always occurred. There's been more of this kind of, parachuting in from someplace else to solve problems. And I think more than anything, that's probably a key lesson, again, that we've learned from the pandemic, that the solutions really need to be driven from the ground up. Maybe a question to you, Roz, about as large global funders that like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are, as you begin to think about the kinds of investments that you're going to continue to make in driving sort of vaccine innovation, in particular in the flu space and in other spaces, How is the foundation beginning to think about that and sort of beginning to think about a space in which there's a sort of democratization of that science and that capacity building?
So I think from our perspective, we've been preparing for a pandemic for a long time. So, you know, we're not starting from scratch. We already have an established flu strategy, coronavirus. We have, you know, genomic sequencing and surveillance projects and everything that feeds into this, and thinking about how vaccines are delivered and how vaccines are paid for and how we advocate for the use of vaccines. So we're not starting from ground level. And I think, you know, the new technologies that we have are a fantastic opportunity, though, for us to revisit that strategy and make sure that we're moving in the right direction. There is a lot of excitement around mRNA vaccines, but there's a great deal that we don't know about them yet for flu. And so, you know, I think we can think about mRNA, and certainly that's an area that we'll be really interested in evaluating further. But one of the most exciting things for me about being here this week is seeing the amount of energy, interest, enthusiasm, passion that there still is for flu, and the great ideas for vaccines that are not mRNA technology. And a lot of those that I've been looking at, seeing today, for example, were all very young investigators coming up through the ranks that are presenting these new data and bringing these new ideas. So I think from my perspective, I'm really excited to see how those develop. I would like to see more coming from low and middle income countries in terms of the scientists, investigators that we're supporting. And I'm also interested in understanding how the early stage projects that we typically take, the very upstream vaccine design, vaccine development projects for flu, how those can then be translated into you know, the real thing, the real vaccine that comes out of the end and can be picked up by globally, not just in high-income countries.
Maybe back to you, Chris, just to talk a little bit around this idea of sort of building that, again, that sort of workforce and that space that needs to be sustainable on the ground to support the kinds of systems that are being facilitated by the tech transfer and the hubs that are being built. What is WHO doing in that space?
So I think it was maybe earlier this year or late last year, in addition to the mRNA tech transfer hub, WHO announced the Global Biomanufacturing Hub as well. And so that's in collaboration with the government of the Republic of Korea, and also in close collaboration with IVI, the International Vaccine Institute. And so there is this huge push to make sure that access to the training is equitable as well. So that it's really kicking off right now. I think they're having their first training either this month or next month. And it's not exclusive to the mRNA tech transfer hub. It's really growing the global manufacturing workforce for vaccines and biologicals. And so I think that's really the first attempt. I know there's been talk of maybe having more of those hubs, you know, sort of regionally, to make sure that we're really providing the global opportunity. But governments have, you know, a role here as well to make sure that their national policies are you know, attracting talent and helping the manufacturers recruit and retain their staff. And then they have, you know, a real obligation to work with academia to make sure that they're, you know, growing the pool of local researchers and vaccinologists. So really, there's at all levels. Everybody has a role at all levels, essentially, to build that workforce.
Tiago, maybe again, going back to Butantan and the experience in Brazil, are there particular models, are there things that were done when some of the early work in building out Butantan was sort of put together to do just that, to create that sort of sustainable pipeline of the people and the human power that really is the engine of the work?
Yeah, we have an interesting case first because we were a company with 121 years, so we have a very historical background with researchers and manufacturers from different ages, and this is possible to train people to get for the next wave of technology. But not only with this, we are connected with the international companies with like the CVMN that we have programs supported with by Bill Melinda Gates Foundation and PATH and other like Imperial College of London, that we have also initiative that we can provide to the part of the employees some training. Even myself, I was training here, here not, but in US, sorry, and North Carolina State University with support from the Bill Melinda Gates Foundation, and we are working with this kind of initiative to have, and with the growing of the company, with more employees, we are able to train new generation of technician and employee for other technologies, or to start to pass what we have learned and become it sustainable. Nevertheless, we are based in São Paulo, so this is the main city in the South America in terms of population, in terms of university. So we work closely with the university, with other companies. So we are lucky that we are in the middle of a good ecosystem to have the training for new technologies and to keep new staff trained.
Maybe I'll go to Eric and William now, sort of to pick up on that, both in terms of what's happening in the spaces that you're working in, to sort of plan for that, to think about that, and to say, how are we going to take, the great talent that you already have, sort of feed it into certain pipelines, but then also keep thinking about growing it and sustaining it, particularly as it has to align with where technology is going. And is there, I mean, to me, I sort of feel like it's almost like what we say in the US, the wild, wild west. And there's this opportunity with a lot of the new technology to imagine that Africa could be on the cutting edge of that, because you've got all this opportunity to kind of capitalize on it now in this new moment. So I don't know if maybe
if I may go first, yeah, we've made it clear. I think there are about 3 countries now that are about to manufacture mRNA vaccines, but in Ghana that will be the last step. They will do fill and finish. But we've made it clear to the companies that look, manufacturing vaccines and biologics, not just like any other dosage form where you can have 2 graduates and high school personnel for them to complete a batch. In this case, it's different, so they would have to invest in technology and then in personnel, because from personnel, everybody from the beginning to the end will have to be knowledgeable, and they should know that. So they've been conscientized, and then, like we've told them, look, the regulators themselves are training staff to build capacity from the GMP and then to the quality control, and then those are evaluation to release vaccines. So the industry also would have to do the same thing, and they've been conscientized, and that's gone into policy. But how they will do it, I think, William, he's a member of the National Vaccine Committee.
This discussion is really music to my ears, because with the African Vaccine Manufacturing Initiative, we've been pushing this advocacy for vaccine manufacturing in Africa for a couple of years, and because of GAP, the GAP program for the influenza vaccine, we realized that capacity building, human resource was a key, pillar. So actually, as Eric said, for Ghana's vaccine roadmap, which is now a national policy, capacity building, human resource is a major activity. And Chris referred to the WHO Biomanufacturing Institute. We've already had colleagues who've gone for training and completed the training and come back. It also included some regulators, and this was Africa-wide. It was also coordinated by the the Africa CDC. So as he said, for Butantan, we recognized that key fact that it has to be a private sector, driven process. So we're encouraging the private sector to look closely at the issue of recruiting and maintaining staff who have the skills in vaccine manufacturing. And then separately, we're also encouraging academia to develop the requisite new programs for vaccine manufacturing, to have modules incorporated into the academic training so that we would be producing people to staff the industry. And then also for R&D itself. So I'm glad you mentioned the presence of young scientists here who are being supported and understand the new technologies and find ways that will make better vaccines and move forward. I mean, I was pleasantly surprised when we engaged with the European Union, and it was pointed that some of these vaccines are now going to become open license. So it will be a good opportunity, to form partnerships with the big pharma and create opportunities for partnerships to produce them, in Africa, and then utilize the technology transfer accordingly. So we note that, some of these technologies are proprietary. The skills that industry has built up over the years is immense, and this is a source that we can tap into. And so we're looking at opportunities with pharma for training, practical, so that it becomes a skill-shared, opportunities to build capacity to actually move the vaccine manufacturing program going forward. It has to be sustainable. So having human resource who will be in place and maintain and acquire new skills and push this forward is really very important.
William, if I may add, right now, look at the continent. Those even manufacturing the conventional or traditional dosage form, they spend a lot of money in bringing expatriates from the Far East. If you go to most African countries, you look at all the industries, the key personnel are all not Africans. They are from other parts of the world, and that would not be very sustainable if we want to continue manufacturing vaccines. So that's a key thing that has to be tackled.
I think that one way is also to have staff to undertrain. I read a piece by one of our colleagues who's a vaccine expert. He said making vaccines is like cooking. You have to follow the menu. You have to do it repeatedly. You can't add too much salt or too less sugar. You have to get it right, and it has to be the same formula each time. And you're the regulator, so you know that this is not something that you have to be like a Michelin 5-star chef.
So to this point of sort of the need to maintain political will as well, to really encourage that investment that I think it's recognized it needs, as Chris was referring to, it needs to come from all levels. The investment, of course, needs to come from the private sector, but it needs to come at the global level. It needs to come from national, the national level as well. And based on what the experience of almost all countries have been, not just around sort of lost lives, but the tremendous challenge to the livelihoods of people. As we think about sort of pandemic preparedness in the future, we think about the impact that outbreaks and infectious diseases have in general, and in particular flu, which is this constant sort of seasonal burden that then gets wrapped up in always being part of a pandemic threat. How do we drive this idea that it's about health, it's about economic security, but also economic development? And I wonder, just maybe in particular to Eric and William and Tiago, how the decision makers that you work with are thinking about this in terms of an opportunity to not just create that security, but actually create new opportunity and economic development as we think about these more regionalized ecosystems and that sort of life science space.
Okay, if I may start, yeah? There's a saying, there's an African saying that it's only an unwise person who does not learn from his mistakes. That was in 2014 to 2016 when Ebola broke out. We said, oh, Ebola it's in the region, so we need to build that capacity to manufacture vaccines, build up sites for clinical trials. Just after the disease went, everything just went flat. till 2020, and then COVID came. And as such, I think most countries, getting to the end of 2021, almost all the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, nobody had even had more than 20% coverage. And the most populous country, as at we were evaluating an application that was about 2 months ago, considering whether placebo trials should be conducted could be conducted on the continent. And I said, look, we are the most populous, and our coverage is just 12%. So looking at this figure, we think we can authorize a placebo study. So looking at this from hindsight, yeah, based on what COVID has taught us, I agree with you totally that no, flu is also just a problem on the continent. And now that there's a goodwill and then a political will, I think we would have to take advantage to build capacity to look at this thing very seriously. And I think I agree with you.
Well, to add to that, I think it's clear that COVID has re-energized, especially, from low middle income countries, seeing an opportunity. I mean, for us, I think we've had a lot of support from the Ministry of Finance, and that has been a very good, push for our vaccine roadmap. We've had, funds allocated in the national budget to support our vaccine program. And so that's the first time that, we've had finance actually pushing a health agenda. And that's something that we should thank COVID for. And I guess it's also become clear that every country cannot make a vaccine. So now there's been, high-level discussions at the African Union to pool resources, to look at regional approaches, to look at where the strengths are. And we already have countries in Africa, South Africa, Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Senegal, who've had experience with vaccine, manufacturing, whether on a fill-finish basis or just looking at adapting appropriate technology. So it's a different season now. Unfortunately, flu is not seasonal in Africa. We actually have flu all year round. So to make the business case for influenza vaccine use, we actually need to do more work on disease burden, improve surveillance. But again, the lesson from COVID is that we have these different variants, and this is something we've known for flu. That's why we have the continuous surveillance, looking at what types of flu is circulating, and that goes into the vaccine, candidate selection meeting. So I think that we're using all this to push and create a more significant opportunity for vaccine manufacturing in Africa, noting the challenges, noting the difficulties, but it's become more doable now. And I know that there's stronger political commitment to push this, forward. And there's keen interest from Big Pharma. I think you may have heard this year, Moderna is investing $500 million in the plant, and I think they selected Kenya. We also have the BioNTech partnership with Rwanda, Senegal, and Ghana. And then we also know of other, entities that are also, Merck is supporting various programs in various countries in Africa. So these are significant opportunities that represent, good partnerships and opportunities going forward.
If I may add, this also, like now what happens, anytime there's an outbreak, they just kill the birds and then that's all you end there. Like, how many birds have we killed this year? I think about 2 or 3 times. They just kill the birds and that's all, everything ends there.
But again, I think if I refer to Sarah Gilbert's lecture, she talked about, work on MERS, work on Nipah, work on Lassa. And I know that there are programs, CEPI is supporting programs that are looking at these other, diseases that are, problems in our part of the world. So again, knowing what we know about influenza and that this is a constant threat. We've had various outbreaks of bird flu in poultry. So we know that we need to prepare, for any possible crossover to humans from the animals. So the need to push the flu agenda is very clear. And taking part in symposia and meetings like this gives us the knowledge to go back and work with, the regional bodies to try and push this forward.
In Brazil, although this pandemic brought a huge economic impact on the society, we don't see agenda on the decision-making process and the leaders for the public sector to invest not only in facilities and manufacturers, but even in R&D. So we are seeing the reduction of investment on universities and projects for new developments it's quite important in terms of new technology that we are discussing here in Belfast. So on public sector, I don't see a clear agenda, clear willingness. On the other hand, we had during this pandemic a huge support from the private sector at Brazil, at the society to want to collaborate and invest in the institute. And also we saw a willingness for international sides also see it's working, so we invest where it's working. So unfortunately, in Brazil, we are going now for a new election period next week, and the investments and the financials are moved for the political agenda. So it's not a state commitment, but it's a political commitment. So this is what we observe there.
So, Chris, I think that I might give you the sort of the last word on that. WHO plays a big role in influencing how national level governments think about planning for pandemics, how they're going to be thinking about how to shape sort of the next generation of developments in terms of influenza preparedness. What's your sense of where the space is headed, and how has that sort of factored into the work that you've done in trying to build the tech hubs?
Yeah, I think, with the mRNA tech transfer hubs, that's the primary focus, and of course we want all of them to be producing COVID-19 mRNA vaccines in the next couple of years. But of course, pandemic flu will be one of the options. We want these manufacturers to have the capacity for a pandemic, and we know flu is the prototype for when you think of a pandemic pathogen. And so certainly we'll continue to push and highlight throughout this project how important epidemic and pandemic preparedness are for the manufacturer, for the country, the government. And so for pandemic preparedness, as countries are looking at their planning, post-COVID, and maybe having a broader respiratory pathogen pandemic preparedness viewpoint, it's just going to be so critical that the manufacturer and private sector writ large just be at the table as they're developing those plans, they're exercising them, that the plans actually carve out a piece for these local manufacturers, because if governments want to invest in preparedness, they have to invest in that manufacturing capacity and having that warm base, whatever it is. Of course, I would love for all of them to produce seasonal flu vaccines, but I recognize my bias, and not all of them can or should. And so certainly, they'll, in the interpandemic period, they'll produce sort of whatever makes sense for them. But the government has to invest in them if they really want pandemic preparedness.
All right. I want to give a few minutes in case there are any audience comments or questions for this fantastic panel.
We received the following question from the audience. I work in the UK in the NHS, and we have a fantastic free vaccine program. Yet we still have a huge problem with inequity, despite the fact that we can give vaccine to everybody who needs it. So my question is, if you had unlimited vaccine from any manufacturer, how would you handle vaccine inequity in your own countries?
So let me wear my WHO hat now. So I'm supporting the regional office in Africa to plan a scientific conference, hopefully in November in Cape Town. So this is good advocacy for that conference. And this is one specific issue that we would like to discuss, look at lessons learned, best practices from the different countries, and come up with what will be the best way to actually get vaccines to those who need them. It's becoming clear that we need a targeted, vaccination drive. Not just having the vaccine. Having the vaccine is not enough. to identify not just the at-risk population, but the population that needs the vaccine most. I mean, in this conference, we've heard about the various studies on COVID, antibodies, seroprevalence, etc. So it's clear that we really need to understand vaccine hesitancy better and come up with strategies that will enable us to get a vaccine to those who need it most. So that's a very important point. And this is, as you said, even though your vaccine program is free, this again ties into the sustainability issue, because even if the vaccine is free and you can't get it to the people, then what's the use of making the vaccine in the first place?
Yeah, I completely agree. Having the vaccine isn't the only thing. And like I was saying at the beginning, there's the ecosystem. And I think today we have maybe 120 countries that have influenza vaccination policies, but then every year we have about 500 million doses that are used. So we don't understand yet how those policies are being translated into uptake. And so I would prefer more, maybe take back some of the vaccines and give me more money to, pump into these, studies trying to figure out what are the drivers of acceptance and demand, and, how can we leverage health workers more to get the message out there to their patients. We have the identified target groups for influenza vaccinations, so how can we get closer to those patients and understand why they're not taking it, what can be done to drive uptake better.
Let me just add to that, again, from my experience in Africa, we have what we call the CSM belt. It's a specific line, that geographical range across parts of West Africa, where we have cerebrospinal meningitis every year. Every year, the CSM vaccine is made available, and people rush to get their jabs because they've seen people die from CSM each year. But in this era of COVID, with free COVID vaccines available, and people would not take the COVID jab. They wouldn't go for the COVID vaccine. So you have the same community. They recognize exactly what their need is, and then they decide what's good for them. So it's very clear that we need to do some more work, a lot of hard work, to get people to improve vaccine uptake, and especially if we are going to push for influenza vaccine uptake in areas where people live with influenza all the time, and therefore we really need to understand how we can get them to accept and take up the vaccine, and therefore make it sustainable.
Well, I may take that as a cue to tee up. I would encourage everyone to see my colleague's presentation tomorrow at the 4 o'clock session, in which the team looked very specifically at this idea and how really important it is to connect between what kind of vaccines you're making, what you know about the community that needs that vaccine, and understanding that level of demand, and really what is going to drive these successful systems in which vaccines are more readily available, are made at high standards, but are actually demanded by the populations that they're seeking to benefit. I just want to give a huge thank you to all the panel members. Thanks so much for joining us. And this is a first in a series of conversations that we hope to be having around the IVR, around sort of the next generation of influenza vaccine development. And you've teed up lots of questions and many more issues that we'll explore. So you'll be hearing from all of us as those conversations continue. So thanks very much.
Thanks for watching. For more conversations with experts examining the future of the vaccine ecosystem, visit our website, influenzer.org. And to catch our next episode, sign up for our newsletter and follow us on Twitter @TheInfluencers.